Hello interwebs, welcome to Let's Fix Computers, or Let's Build Computers, or whatever I'm calling it these days, because there's no plan anymore. Anyway, we're doing a build today. This is a last minute before Christmas build. This is an NZXT H7 Flow. This build and the parts for it were supplied by the customer. They came in with a pile of boxes and said, "Can you build my PC for me?" And I said, "Sure thing." I then looked at the pile of boxes and saw that there was a Gigabyte P750 GM there. You know, that 1 gigabyte power supply? And I said, "Accept that. Get that out my shop, please." So we've got a different power supply for it. But we're going to build it up. Now, I don't do a lot of build videos these days, or review videos for that matter, and I kind of want to get back in practice. So this video and another build video that I've got that I might be recording right after this one, these are me de-rusting on build and review stuff. So the actual format of this video might wander around a bit, so bear with me. But we're going to do a quick tour of this case, build a computer up in it, and get it up and running, basically. So roll the intro, and I'm going to unbox all of the parts. So, NZXT, or NZXT, is a company that I want to like. I like their concepts, but sometimes they make it hard, you know? But ironically, both the computers I need to build are in NZXT cases. Not because I intended to, that's just how it came out. So I guess I'm looking at some of their modern stuff now. I went through a phase of being super into NZXT, but then they kind of went a bit stagnant for a couple of years because they kind of refused to acknowledge that airflow existed and kind of needed to be paid attention to. And when the airflow meta came in and everyone realized that airflow actually was very important, NZXT were like, la la la, we can't hear you. Our cases are perfect. So yeah. However, now they've got airflow cases. Behold, mesh. We can once again appreciate them. So this is, as I mentioned, the H7 Flow, and it costs about £120. Not sure how much it is in dollary dues. It's probably about 120 US dollars as well, ish, because pounds and dollars are about the same at the moment for when buying stuff. And that means that this thing is basically the same price as a Corsair 4000D Airflow, which is ever so slightly cheaper, but basically the same price class. So the Corsair 4000D Airflow is what I will be comparing this against. And general perceptions are it is very similar. It's a very similar size. It's got the same kind of, it's got a decent quality build to it, you know. Everything, there's lots of metal joins together. It's rigid. It's got like this bit around the edge here. It doesn't feel like just a tin box with side panels on it. And that is what you're paying for with a premium case. When you buy a case that is £40 or £50, it will just be like a tin box with side panels on it. Whereas with this one, there's a lot more structure in there, which is what makes it more expensive. And that goes quite a long way. Now, with this case and the Corsair, it doesn't go as far as having, sort of exotic bits that come out like some of Fractal's recent offerings. And I think this is where Fractal may have a better value proposition with their cases. But you know, it's subtle. It depends on how important that kind of thing is to you. So yeah, but anyway, the build quality is good. We've got two fans in here. They're just standard NZXT Airflow fans. They are 3-pin. They do come pre-plumbed in, so you know they've tidied the cable along this these little hooks around to the back. Same with the front one, instead of just leaving a wire just hanging out in the middle. And this is something that NZXT are very good at. When you buy their case, it comes pre-plumbed. Like all the wires along the back, they've already been loomed down here to here, you know, and like we're going to have to pull these apart and redo them, but they haven't just left all the wires hanging out on the inside. And I think that's actually a nice touch that not a lot of manufacturers do. It makes this, you know, it adds a little, I don't know, it's it's a little something that makes me like them that bit more. We've got these cable tidying ducts around the back as well. Personally, I think these are of questionable use. It's not very often when I'm building a computer that I find these actually useful. I don't know why, just every time I try and run cables through them, I find they just don't seem to work. However, these ones are of a much newer style than I've previously seen. And as you can see, it's more of a matter of their hooks rather than a channel. And that means it's a lot easier to just hook a wire in there and then bring it out halfway. Because the chances of a cable actually going all the way through the duct is pretty slim. But now, because we've got these hooks here, it's a lot easier for the cable to just exit wherever you need it to. So I feel like these are probably significantly more useful than previous cable ducting. We've got this nice sort of U shape up the top here, which I like as well. That's quite wide, and it's got these little Velcro tabs there. So this is really good because this is good dump space for some of the cables that come out the top here, especially for things like if you've got a all-in-one liquid cooler that's got a couple of fans on it in the pump, there'll be a bundle of wires that come out the back of there. And usually I kind of have to leave that floating here, but that's just a nice little dump space to put that. And again, we've got a U shape here, so the CPU power cables and stuff can go along there. And we've got just Velcro tiebacks everywhere. So nice attention to detail all around. The mesh front panel, this guy just pulls off, so just literally pull it off. It's reasonably stiff. It's not a particularly exotic design, it's just holes. I quite like the way that Corsair are doing different shapes with theirs instead of just holes, but it doesn't really matter. So obviously fully mesh filtered. How does this come off? That mesh filter just comes off. You just pull that out and then that clips back in. So maintenance is fairly straightforward there. I'm not sure, can that be taken off from the bottom? Yeah, you could take that off from the bottom. So that can be removed without taking the side panels off. So maintenance is easy. So yeah, I approve of that. Actually, I'm going to leave that off because we're going to be changing out some fans anyway. There's also a little mesh filter down the bottom here. I think that's because there is a solid version of this case, the Elite, which I think is glass fronted to show off fans. Don't buy that one because this is not an intake. This is not a sufficient intake. Your computer cannot intake all of its air just through there. So no matter how much NZXT want them to. So yeah, ignore that. Go with the mesh. On the top, again, we've got a nice big wide mesh top. There is, the rails are excellent there, actually. How do we get that mesh out? Does that come off? Oh, you know what? I said this doesn't have any exotic bits that come off, but I think it does. Oh, it does. Ooh, there we go. That top panel also comes off. Nice. And then we've got another mesh grill on top there for the top. And this gives us a really good view of the top rails. Top rails, I love this. This is really good. We've got nice big offset there, so it will clear water coolers. And as you can see, they're long rails instead of holes. So you can slide and position the radiator wherever you want. I haven't done the measurements here. Not sure what you can fit up there. Let's find out. You know what? I've got a big one to hand. Hold on a sec. This is a 420mm radiator. If this can fit in the top of this case, you're fine, basically. This is a tall order. I'll be impressed. Absolutely not. How about the front? With some work, yes. I think you get a 480 in the front with a bit of Tetrising, but not up the top. A 360, I think, is doable. Let me get some fans to check that. 360 is a yes. So yeah, 360 rad up the top, no problem. 280, yes. 420, no. Up the front, I'm 99% certain you could put whatever you want up the front. I can't see an issue with that. So yeah. And front panel, NZXT are really good at front panels. This is a really clean, slick front panel. Combo headphone jack. Separates are nice, however, there's not a lot of people using these anyway. I know you're out there, don't worry, I see you, but there's not many of you. Type-C port, dual USB 3s. These are really nice and clean as well, as you can see. They're not horrible, low-quality stuff. This is a nice touch, and we've got a power button with a ring light around it. I kind of like the way there's just no markings on this either. There's just absolutely no symbols or anything at all. You know what these are. You know what they do. There doesn't need to be any writing there. It's quite understated. Same goes for the other logos. On the side here, we do have the NZXT logo there, which you can, if I move it in the light, you can see that's there. And the front panel as well also has the NZXT logo down the bottom. Again, just I don't know what you call this effect, but it's black on black, you know, it's satin on matte. So very understated. It's a subtle case, this. And I think this is what NZXT are good at, personally. My first impressions of this case are really good. This feels like what we wanted NZXT to be for a while. But while they weren't making airflow cases, they just weren't viable. I owned a H500i. I loved it when it came out, but the airflow on that case was terrible. There's no other way of putting it. It was terrible. It looked amazing, but it's not a good case. So yeah, I mean, if you're running low to mid-end hardware, airflow is not so important and you'll be fine. But when you start adding in high-end hardware and high-end graphics cards that are pumping out 300 watts of heat, suddenly airflow does start to matter. That's when you'll care. Your computer will work with low airflow, but it'll be loud, it'll be noisy because the fans have got to work harder. And that may even extend so far as your graphics card just not quite boosting as much as it could do because it's just running that little bit hotter. So, like I say, airflow isn't going to stop your computer from working, but it can stop you from getting the best out of it. So, I've waffled about the case. Let's start building. So, headline specs of this build, we've got a Intel 13600K CPU going in here, so 13th gen i5, which is a very quick gaming CPU. That is going into an MSI Z690A DDR4, so DDR4 motherboard, which means DDR4 RAM. And the motherboard itself, this is not a very exotic motherboard, to be brutally honest, but man, next-gen motherboards are expensive. So I'm not the least bit surprised to see a mid-range board like this. So this is on the cheap end for a Z690. However, it is a Z690, and DDR4 is completely adequate just because it makes the platform significantly cheaper. The cost of DDR5 is coming down, but it's not there yet. And when you're building a new computer and you factor in the cost of next-gen motherboards and DDR5, it does add a couple of hundred onto the cost of the machine. And that kind of stings when you're already forking out. So we've got the i5 going in there. Graphics card is going to be this Asus TUF. This is a Radeon 6800 XT. So nice chunk of graphics card. These AMD graphics cards are really good bang for buck right now. Don't be afraid to go AMD with graphics cards. They really can still deliver. A lot of people have got a lot of things to say about drivers and stuff like that, but I've used a couple of the latest RDNA 2 cards, and I found them to be a perfectly good experience. So it's worth keeping in mind, especially considering the cost of them. So the power supply, I'm putting in a second-hand RM850X to power this, a Corsair RM850X. And before anyone says anything, no, this is not the one from my torrent with the mad coil whine. This is another second-hand one that I've got that is a known good. So this is a second-hand power supply, but it's all I had in stock for this last-minute build, and these are still cracking good power supplies, and this will easily power everything that goes in here. And Also, we're kind of building it up to make sure there's that little bit of headroom, because with this motherboard, it would be quite possible to drop in a higher end CPU at a later date if so desired. So I'm going to build to make sure that that is possible. And as I say, considering the customer did walk in with that Gigabyte P750, that's a big no-no. So this will be significantly better than that. I'm going to put the power supply in first, get that fitted. And we have got a vented bottom panel for this, so I'm going to put in the power supply fan pointing up. And you can put it up or down. There is a vent at the back of here, a filtered vent. I like to go fan pointing upwards. That can also be advantageous if you're running a power supply like this one that has a fan shut-off mode, because it means that the hot air can rise out of it, and it does mean that it can just passively radiate a bit more heat. Some of the manufacturers like Seasonic actually recommend this orientation. So let's get that guy screwed in. And I've already picked out the power cables that I'm going to attach to this in advance. So we've got the 24-pin ATX. I've got 2 EPS cables for the CPU, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And I've got 2 VGA power cables for the graphics card. And that theoretically should be all we need in this machine. Oh, I will need a SATA cable actually, because we've got a hard drive going on in here. SATA power cable as well. And hard drive enclosure does pop out. That screw was supposed to be captive. However, I was pushing it the wrong way, so it fought me. And this hard drive cage does have multiple positions it can be in, so it can slide backwards and forwards depending on how much room you need for your power supply versus how much room you need up the front for fans and or a radiator. If you're not decking out the front, then I would recommend just moving it all the way to the left to give yourself more space here. However, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to leave it out of the case until the last moment when we'll put in the hard drive for that. And that gives me loads of room to get to the back of the power supply here. Well, normally I plug in all of my modular cables before I put the power supply in the case, and now I've just rediscovered why I do that, because I'm having trouble getting them to plug in properly and feel like they're connected properly. So I'm going to take this out of the case, plug the cables in, and then put it back in again. Now let's vaguely start getting these cables into position. Right, I've plumbed in the power supply and put all the cables vaguely in the general direction they need to go. I've just loose fitted all of the ties in place so I can still move things, but all of the cables are roughly in position. So when I go to fit the motherboard next, I can just plug everything in and then we can pull them back and tie them down tightly. But before I do that, I'm going to put in some more case fans. So the case has come with just 2 airflow fans, but this isn't really a configuration that I would recommend running with on this case. It is intended that you fill this thing with your own fans, and yeah, these fans are not the best if I'm honest. So these are coming out, and we've got a box of 4 Arctic PWM 140mm fans. So I'm going to take these out and put the Arctics in. They are, to be exact, they are the P14 fans. And these fans are nondescript black fans from Arctic, but they are really cheap, these things, and they are 4-pin fans, so PWM, and they're just really good. They've got decent spec, and a box of these things is dirt cheap. So if you've bought a case and you just want to fill it out, like, look how good that spins. It's great. If you've bought a case and you just want to deck it out, buy a box of these Arctics and you're done, basically. Right, let's check our motherboard standoff alignment. The motherboard has a standard alignment with everything is just in the 9-hole pattern. So this guy isn't offset, this guy isn't offset, and so, oh, actually that's the guy that is sometimes offset up here. This guy is sometimes down there. So offer the motherboard up, have a check. And if any of these guys are out of place, then put them in place. However, before that goes in, we do need to put in the I/O shield. All motherboards should just have a built-in I/O shield these days. Don't know why they don't. Especially a flagship chipset board. I think I said this about the last MSI board I looked at. They might be the only people not doing it now. Out of, like, you know, the mainstream aftermarket brands anyway. And for the people who are like, oh, you should build the motherboard up before you put it in. We're putting in a water cooler. And so because of that, I'm just not going to bother. If we were doing an air cooler, then yes. But if you're putting in a water cooler anyway, not really worth the trouble in my opinion. It doesn't really matter. As always though, do it your way. Do whatever feels comfortable. I mentioned earlier on that I was running 2 EPS cables on this, and people who watch me will know that usually I don't connect both of the EPS connectors up. And this is because the 8-pin EPS connector, it's good for 300 watts, and the vast majority of CPUs ain't pulling 300 watts. So in the vast majority of cases, unless you're doing extreme overclocking, and by extreme overclocking I mean you're using sub-zero cooling, you don't need more than an 8-pin connector to your CPU. However, some of the latest gen CPUs can pull 300 watts. And if you're getting close to those 300 watts, then you should probably run both the cables, just so you've got that overhead. I mean, realistically, if you're running a decent power supply, you're probably fine anyway. But in this instance, the i5 we're putting in here ain't going to draw 300 watts. However, again, for future-proofing, I'll connect up both cables, just so if it does get changed to an i7 or an i9 later on down the line, there's not going to be any problems with that. So these Arctic fans have daisy chain cables on them. And so as such, the front 3, I've just daisy chained those together and plugged them into sys fan 2. Then the rear fan, I'll run that through this cable duct here, plug that into sys fan 1 that's in the top corner of the motherboard. And that means we've got a nice simple fan arrangement. All the fronts are linked together and the back is on its own. And on a modern motherboard, it's completely fine to daisy chain fans like this. These fans will pull, you know, 300 milliamps peak kind of thing. And in fact, we can check. Oh, this one's even lower actually. This is 120 milliamps rated. So these are actually really low power fans actually. At any rate, the majority of fans are, you know, are up to 300 peak. And so if you've got 3 of them hooked up together, that's 900 milliamps. Most fan headers are good for an amp. And that 300 milliamps peak, that's going to be at spool up. So if you switch on the computer and they go from 0 to 100, they're going to wind up at 300 milliamps each. And then as soon as they're up to speed, that's going to fall off again. So you're going to get a momentary high load on the fan header, but it's not sustained at that level. So a fan header is more than capable of having 3 fans daisy chained onto it, no problem at all, which is why I often use fan splitters and things like that. If it's a really cheap motherboard and you're putting in big fans, I'd be a little bit less certain about it, but I've never seen it be a problem. And if you're using a cheap motherboard, you're probably not in a case decked out with fans either. This is a low-end Z670 motherboard and it's still got crap loads of fan headers on it, so no problem there. Right, now let's populate our motherboard. So we'll start with the CPU. So on the LGA 1700, we've got 2 notches at the bottom of the CPU and 2 notches at the top there. So it's impossible to put it in the wrong way round. And they said that about the old CPUs as well. Yeah, I've still seen people manage it. However, oriented with the motherboard, it goes in the correct way up. So we'll lower that down there. Oh, do I have to take this off first now? Install the processor before removing the cover. No? Ugh. Oh, that feels horrid. Oh, there we go. It wasn't settled properly. The new Intel ILM, that's this hold-down system, is apparently pretty crap. And if you're running an i7 or an i9, apparently there's a lot to be gained by using an aftermarket hold-down system. I've not yet had a system that's been worth doing that with. However, if I were to buy a high-end Intel system, I'd probably be investigating one of those. Memory is a set of 32 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance, and this is 3600 CL18. So nothing to write home about, but perfectly fine. Can probably screw a little bit more performance out of these. However, 3600 is more than adequate. And like the 3600 megatransfers bit is fine. It's the CL18 is just not super inspirational. At 3600, I'd be looking for 17, maybe 16. 3600 16 would be impressive. Got a Samsung 980 here coming out from the customer's old machine. It's already got their Windows install on it. All right, so now we're going to get our water cooler mounted. So the water cooler has also come out of their old computer. And as you can see, it's a little bit dusty, it's a little bit grubby where it's had use. So I'm going to do a cleanup on this. Let's get this guy out the way for a moment. Now I've already used an air duster to blow the worst of the dust out of this, but a lot of the dust is just caked on, which is what happens to these things over time. So I'm going to pull these fans off, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to spray it with some glass cleaner, just some window and glass cleaner, and use a toothbrush just to brush it down, and that should shift the caked on dust. And it should just make it go nice and black and make it look shiny and new again. At this point in the video, I did a rambling speech about how old AIOs can sometimes be a little bit low on liquid but still work just fine. And I've had plenty of these Corsair AIOs that have gone on for years, no problems. But this one actually failed during testing after this build was complete. So we'll chop that out, and I'll just say now that we replaced it almost immediately afterwards. So this is not to say that you can't reuse old AIOs, but just keep in mind that if they're starting to sound a bit gurgly and you can clearly hear a lot of sloshing in them, they're probably not far off of failure. So just keep that in mind if you're going to refurbish an old one like I'm doing here. Okay, as you can see, that looks a million times better than it did before. There's a few marks deep in the gaps here and there, but no one's going to see that. However, the overall first impressions of it are that it looks almost brand new instead of old and glossy. Let's get it in the case. There we go, and I've plugged the AIO into pump fan 1, not CPU fan 1. You can use either, however, pump fan generally assumes that it's going to have an all-in-one plugged into it. So by default, it will just run at a full 12 volts. I've lost the cap for my thermal paste. Here it is. Where was I? Yeah, so the pump fan by default is usually on a full 12 volts as opposed to a fan curve. And also just it means that it will be labeled by the BIOS as a pump, not a fan. So obviously this is just useful for labeling things nicely. Ultimately, on the majority of motherboards, every fan header can be reprogrammed to do everything. The only other difference is on some motherboards, usually higher end ones, sometimes the water pump fan headers are designed for 2 amps of load instead of 1 amp. So they can take bigger loads like big water pumps. So that's the only time where it might be a consideration, but by and large, it doesn't actually matter what fan header you use. It's just labeling. So I think we're ready to put the graphics card in. So I'm going to lay it down, slot the graphics card in, and tidy these cables up. There we go. It's a slight shame that we're just covering up the logo with the power cables here, but there's not a lot I can do about this without putting in braided cables that I can guide. I suppose I could have had these cables come up from here and come across. That might have averted covering, although I still think we'd get a little bit of cover there. And personally, when you're trying to deal with pigtail cables like this, I think this is the best solution you can feasibly do without taking the custom cable route personally. I think whatever way you spin it, you're probably going to cover up half of the logo. It's going to look bad whatever you do, so you may as well have them just go nice down and straight. And there we go. Let's get the covers on this thing and see if it starts. There we go. Now we'll flip that over, put that side panel on properly. This is the other reason why I do the peel for the customer, because I'm 99% certain that the customer isn't going to pre-treat the glass panels like this. If you don't do this, then basically because it's a brand new side panel that's just had cellophane pulled off of it, all of the dust in the room will just go straight onto the glass. And also your fingerprints will go straight onto the glass. Whereas after doing this, it will feel as smooth as Teflon. Bah. And because it's tinted glass, you can't see anything. I don't like tinted glass, but so please stop doing tinted glass, everyone. It's just, I don't see the point in a glass side panel that you can't see through. Anyway, I think that looks pretty good. Black on black is a good look in modern computers. I do still appreciate it. I like colourful computers, but there's something particularly slick about just black. Let's power it on. And power. Bit of a gurgle from that AIO. You know, I think that has lost a reasonable amount of water, if I'm honest. I'll give it thermal tests before it goes out the door. Right. We're power cycling between DRAM and CPU. It's probably RAM training. Nah, it's taking way too long. All right, here's where we live now. You can see the diagnostic LEDs up there, and the red one is CPU, the green one is DRAM. So it's bouncing down to RAM and then just going straight back up to CPU again. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn it off and on again by holding down the power button, apparently. And then we'll just try it again and see if it starts on the second attempt. Okay, so we've got a 13th gen CPU in a 12th gen motherboard here. I have a suspicion that we actually need a BIOS flash. Because it's bouncing off of the DRAM LED, you might, it could also be a memory issue. However, also, I've no reason to believe that this motherboard has been updated for 13th gen. That is a much more likely scenario here. I will reseat the RAM just in case. However, I'm fairly certain we're going to need a BIOS flash here. Not a big deal on this motherboard because this motherboard has BIOS flashback. So that's just a non-issue for us. If we didn't have BIOS flashback, this would be a disaster because we would need a 12th gen CPU, or we would have to manually reprogram the BIOS on the motherboard, which means BIOS programming, which you really don't want to be doing on a new computer. However, because we've got flashback, this is a non-issue. We could do it with no CPU installed if we wanted to. So I'm just going to turn off the back. I'm just going to reseat that memory just to make sure that it's not just bad memory seating. We are in the correct slots for this because the motherboard on the silk screen, that's the writing on the motherboard, it has got the DIMM slots there, and it has an indicator showing that we use the second and fourth slots first, which is the standard on most motherboards. It's unusual for a board to use a different configuration to that these days. So I'm just going to swap these modules around and just reseat them, just in case they're not in properly. And if it doesn't start on this attempt, I'm going to go straight to a BIOS flash, or at the very least, I'm going to look up the CPU support on this motherboard and confirm it. All right, let's try it again. If it was a no CPU support, I would expect to be stuck on the CPU LED. However, diagnostic LEDs should be taken with a pinch of salt. So yeah. No, that's not even trying. It has no idea what this CPU is. All right, let's go get a BIOS. Or rather, first I'm going to go and get a coffee, because this is that moment where you've just spent a couple of hours building up a PC and it doesn't post. And no matter how long you do this for, hecking sucks when that happens. You know, you keep going, but you still just go, I thought I was done. All right, so we've just gone to the MSI webpage for the Pro Z690A DDR4. If we have a look on the compatibility page here under CPU, as you can see, we've got the 12th gen processors at the bottom here, and then we've got the 13th gen processors at the top. There's our 3600K, and very conveniently, they give us a direct link to the BIOS we need for that particular CPU. You can see that this is a V17, and the 12th gen and older CPUs are 13 and V13 and V11 respectively. And on the previous pages, you can see that all the others are V11 as well. That might be 1.1, I don't know. The point is it's an older BIOS. So let's just download that zip directly. I'll open that up, dig into that, and then we've got a text file and a binary file. What's the text file? I see. Very well. And yeah, it's version 1.7. Cool. So I am going to copy and paste this onto a flash drive. This flash drive is FAT32 formatted. Now, I believe we have to rename this to something. I can never remember what, so let's look that up in the manual while we wait for that to copy. Manual and document, multi-language. Let's see. Blah, 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 blah. Updating BIOS, that might be it. Section 27. Bloody hell, this thing is 254 pages long. There we go, page 30, updating BIOS with the BIOS flash button. Now, for a lot of people, it might be obvious how to do this, but it does vary depending on the motherboard manufacturer. So whenever I do this, I tend to have a quick look in the motherboard manual just so I know what to expect. Because as you'll see in a minute, I hate BIOS flashback, to be brutally honest. I think it's really esoteric. The flash, the LEDs will flash in a certain pattern. They don't really tell you what's going on. It's all a bit scary as far as BIOS flashing goes, in my opinion. So I like to have a quick look just so I can see what to expect. So firstly, we need to rename the BIOS file to msi.rom. So again, some people may know that already, but on some boards you have to rename it to the motherboard model number. And, sometimes you just, and it has to be in all block capitals or not capitals, and just look it up, basically. So we're going to change that to msi.rom. When you're renaming files like this, just make sure that you have file extensions switched on. Otherwise, you might end up with msi.rom. whatever the file name previously was. So now that is a ROM file. And then what we're going to do, blah, 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 plug flash drive in. Right. Press the flash BIOS button to flash BIOS. The LED starts flashing. The LED will be turned off when the process is completed. Okay, fine. So we're going to do that. I think when we push the button, the computer will switch on. But this is kind of what bothers me, is that it doesn't tell you. Like, will the computer switch on when I push the button? Will it switch off when it's done? Will it reboot when it's done? Who knows? This is why I don't like BIOS flashback, is they don't actually tell you what it will look like. So I'm going to plug this in the back. There's a designated USB port that has flash BIOS around it, and the button is next to it. Right, the flash drive is plugged in. The power supply is turned on, and I'm going to push the button now. Okay, the computer hasn't switched on, but as you can see, we've got a flashing light down there. So now we just wait for that to stop flashing. Ah, the computer turned on. All right, so my guess is that it's looked at the drive, it's seen what it needs to see, and now it is actually flashing the BIOS. The diagnostic LED is on CPU for reference. So the CPU light is lit, and that guy is just flashing away. So when that stops flashing, theoretically we should be done. I'll get the capture ready, just so if it actually posts, we'll see it. The light has stopped flashing. I heard the hard drive spin up, and I think we're posting. The diagnostic LEDs are doing things. Okay, it turned off, it turned it back on again. Let's see what we get now. There we go, that's a VGA LED. And boot. No, they've gone off. Ah, there we go, we're booting Windows. Bang in, mate. All right. There we go, and that's what the flashback process looks like on a modern MSI board. So confirmed, needed a BIOS update. Other than that, nothing wrong with it. Okay, right. I'm going to go and dial in some fan curves on this. Dialing in fan curves isn't particularly exciting. I will probably just set them all to the built-in silent curve. Because we've got PWM fans, these things are going to be really quiet. We've got lots of big fans, so we just set them all onto a silent profile, and they will just silently push air through the case. Also, one other thing I forgot as well, there is, I don't know where I've put it, it's around somewhere, there's a USB cable that goes from this Corsair AIO down to a front panel USB 2 header. So I'll route that somewhere out of sight. And then that will allow us to have USB control over the AIO, set the fan speeds there, stuff like that. And that'll be it. So let's cut to the hero shots. So with the updated BIOS, this thing now starts and runs just fine. The NZXT H7 Flow was actually very pleasant to build in. The build quality of the case was great. It was very spacious inside without being too obnoxiously large. And the overall design philosophy of it is still to my liking. My only real criticism is that you could definitely call this case minimalist to a fault. Some of NZXT's cases in the past have had the same issue, where once they're actually built with all the side panels on, they're kind of just squares, in short. And they don't really have any defining lines or features to avoid that. And if that's not a problem for you, then it's fine. But using something like the Corsair 4000D as an example, that one has got a more distinctive front panel design, and it's got a couple of other lines and a couple of other little small signatures on it that just help identify it a little bit better, other than just being a black square. But these are minor nitpicks. If you want stealth, then this case is absolutely going to deliver that. And in addition to that, now NZXT have joined us in the glorious Airflow Master Race. Airflow is no longer an issue with their cases either. With a full complement of fans in it, this thing has got more airflow than you'd need for any hardware. Again, I would also love to see them doing a clear side panel version of it. If they're anything like Corsair, the white version of it probably has a clear side panel. However, I feel like it kind of sucks that you have to make a choice between black and white depending on what side panel you want, instead of them just putting clear side panels in. But aside from that, the actual design and the ease of which the panels go on and come off again is delightful, and you've got that lovely clean top panel interface as well. So past that, I hope you all enjoyed this build. Thank you very much. Have a lovely Christmas, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.